It's getting problematic at this point, but it'll get worse later, trust me. I'm building my very first diorama in Planet 2, which started out great because I opened the game and realized I didn't even know how to start one. Thank you, Mrs. C-Rex, for the tutorial. You're the real MVP. Diorama is what I'd like to call the empty box of delusion. It's empty when you enter, literally just a void of whatever the settings are, and it's delusional because you have all these ideas and then you're stuck with the dread of not knowing how to start. But then an idea came to me from the heavens above. Because the inspiration for my first diorama is the legend of the Chinese moon goddess Chang'e. In the most common version, Chang'e takes 2 elixirs of immortality, and they're so powerful she just straight up ascends to the moon instead of the heavenly court. There she lives alone with the jade rabbit, who either makes medicine or rice cakes, depending on which Asian country you're hearing this from. The story symbolizes love and sacrifice, as Hui, husband of Chang'e, is left behind. And I just really love this legend because it reflects my love for escapism and fantasy, particularly Eastern Asian mythology. Unlike other myths, this one questions immortality, approaching it rather as a sorrow than as a salvation for mankind. Anyway, moving on. Because the inspiration is literally a goddess that lives on the moon, I'm building this purely for nighttime. Challenging, but remember, we're in a delusional void box, so we can try. I started out with building the focal point of the habitat, which is the Moon Palace, where Chang'e lives. This is basically the hard shelter for our animals. The color palette I'd like to work with is soft blues, pinks, whites, and plenty of moonlit accents by gentle lighting. Mind you, that is what I have in my head, but I think we all know that's not always what's gonna happen. This is a build where I really wanted to play around with lights in the game, because I rarely do so or honestly just forget. That's why I wanted to build a night habitat. So I just started on a building, starting with the entrance, which I think worked out pretty well, especially combining it with the quite classical items. I also really want to make something that feels out of this world, so instead of focusing on realism, I just wanted the moon vibe, so this build is really, just fantasy. At first I thought of making the palace as if Chang'e really lives there. I started out with building an elevated area where she could sit at a writing table and write up her poems. I had fun making this with all the separate pieces too. And to repeat more of the moonlit accents that I made outside, I also made some kind of circular decoration from the classical pieces to put behind the main wall, as if the room is some kind of throne room. But as I was scrolling for building pieces to use, I came across these LED tubes that give off the same amazing light, and playing with them I thought using the moon phases would be fun, sort of to keep the theme of the moon. My first idea would be that this habitat was literally on the moon, but after finding this and forming this idea, I changed my concept into more of a floating island in the skies that would be powered by the moon's light. And using the lore of the moon, for example, its phases in the sky, would strengthen that. I have no idea if that makes sense. It does in my head, and you're welcome to visit. But then my head also completely turned on me and had the bright idea of using text. I wanted to convey the theme in the building and thought of using one of my favorite Asian poems by Li Shanyin, who was a Chinese poet and politician in, I think, the Tang dynasty. And there are a few translations of a poem he wrote about the lady in the moon. Candle shadows are dark on mica screens. The Milky Way tilts and morning stars fall by degrees. Chang'e must regret stealing the elixir. Every night, she feels fearful in the blue sky and sea. But I chose to use the shortest for obvious reasons. I don't want to spend hours on something, which I ended up doing because if you watch this in real time, I think you can work out how much time it really took. This really took me back to when I was studying Mandarin and it gave me such a headache, so moving on. Because I already made the circular decoration on the main wall of the room, I decided to add the text to the side walls and went for the Mandarin poem on the left and the English translation on the right. I wanted to build this to really challenge reality and wanted to bring in lush foliage, so I decided to bring that to the main building by elevating it with stairs and adding some flowers. And then it was time to start on the surroundings of the habitat, which I was nervous for. While I want to build something fantastical, I also wanted to build something peaceful and quiet. And the first thing I think of when I say that is a large, calm pond. So I covered the entirety of the terrain in water. Now, just a floating island would also be a bit silly, so I started thinking how people would be able to get here. Maybe Chang'e would open this area to other immortals or even mortals to come to her, or whatever silly story I'm making up right now. So I added a portal using the circular trick, which I actually use a lot in this build. I then saw this trick of adding a water effect in the middle to convey a breakage in dimensions. I think I saw this in the Zodiac Zoo by Zenurix, but I also saw it in a lot of other builds, so if I'm wrong, correct me. I do think this looks cute as it adds that touch of unnatural to the build, as if a floating island wasn't enough already. Then I positioned the main moon palace more to the side of the habitat, so I wanted something smaller to fill in the empty void on the right. So I thought our goddess could use some peace and quiet from the daily duties of being an immortal celestial. I used the tiny Asian bridge, which I absolutely love using each time, and added some sort of cobblestone path along the water, which would bring you to a small pagoda, which will offer some quiet time. Here I also started to play with the lanterns more and added in some details like a teapot and some moon cakes. Also one of my favorites. These are eaten during the Moon Festival, to which people express gratitude to the moon and harvest, and I really recommend them if you can try them one day because they are very yummy. To bring some life to the habitat, we have to add animals. Normally, rabbits are the symbol of the moon in Chinese mythology, but our silly little game didn't add rabbits, which is the biggest missed opportunity since the Barnyard Pack. Instead, we're adding the symbol of longevity and immortality, the red-crowned cranes. Named Dantiange, these are the birds of the immortals. Their white plumage is a sign of purity, while the red crown indicates its reach to the heavens. And here I'm making what I will be spamming in this diorama all over, which is the blossom trees, which I think are very beautiful. And I added pink lights to them as if they're glowing. I think this is honestly the center of this whole build, as these things really give off that celestial and divine mood. Or at least, I hope so. Naturally, I also needed the moon. I first had the idea that Chang'e would just live on the moon, but I think in this case a diorama would be nice to have some sort of floating thing. So as a secondary focal point, yes, I added a few, I wanted to add the moon. We do have the art pieces in the game, but the orb wasn't big enough, so I duplicated the shapes a few times to make a bigger orb. Don't ask me what the item count of this build is, because I don't know and I don't want to know. I then thought the moon palace looked empty, so I wanted to add more details and was thinking of what I could add and what I associate with Asian themes. Naturally, I went for a dragon. They aren't usually associated with the moon, but they do embody strength, good fortune and the spirit of transformation. And I think those themes fit the legend of the Chinese moon goddess pretty well. So for me, this choice makes sense, and if it doesn't for you, well, it is my build. Then I figured this water needs to go somewhere, so I spammed waterfalls all around the habitat, and I think it adds a bit more movement, a bit more dynamics, which is always nice. Then the idea of playing with lights really came in because I added floating lanterns. I think it always fits the celestial and the Asian theme, so I'll just spam them everywhere. And this time I have an actual reason of why they'd be randomly floating around. I also added green lights to the cobblestone path I added earlier, just to create some contrast with the pink. I think green and pink are a really nice color combination to do that. And as a little Easter egg for whoever listened to the legend, I added the jade rabbit at the entrance. This is the point where I started to add the little details, but I do think adding these gave a bit more life to the build overall. I decided to add a bit more greenery, so added some foliage and lights to the water, and maybe also some green to contrast the pinks again. And I also decided to add more pillars to the perimeter of the habitat. I imagine these could serve as some kind of protective boundary. And it was becoming a never-ending circle at this point, because after adding green, I thought there wasn't enough pink. So instead of removing some green like a sane person would do, I added more pink and made some lilies from the 3D boogaloo or whatever it's called. I also added a larger lily on top of the small pagoda just to get a bit more eye catchers. After talking to a friend about this build, I suddenly had the epiphany of adding a smaller island to the side because I thought it looked empty. I'm guessing diorama really isn't my thing after all, because I keep adding more and more. It's getting problematic at this point, but it'll get worse later, trust me. The little island serves as some kind of light source because the lanterns that are floating around are actually born from a golden tree on top of the island. This isn't even a myth or a thing as far as I know, but I don't know. I can imagine the Jade Rabbit or even Chang'e herself taking care of it. Let's call it the star tree. And this is where it really gets worse, and I blame my friend Sheen. So Sheen also made a diorama, and she decided to be a little shit and not reveal anything by the thumbnail of her build. So I decided, okay, I kind of want that too, but I'll take it a step further. So whenever you would load this build, I don't want to show anything yet at the start, so I started building another portal. This time I imagined this portal would be located in a cave somewhere, where you would venture into the wilderness, far away from society, and if you solve the riddle I made, you can enter the habitat of the red-crowned cranes. And that's the trick I really like in these zoo files, because wherever you leave your POV camera and you save the file, will be where other people will load into. In the silence of night, when the moon's glow is bright, step into this portal, bathed in silver light. Wait for her blessing, the goddess serene, only then shall you enter a world unseen. So if you open the file, you'll be met with this silly little cave, and when the moon hits the portal just right, you'll be transported into the celestial kingdom of the cranes. Or something like that. I just made that up.